So hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. Actually, I've changed it to Climbing Mount Sophia. I've John Vervaeke has left out the on a couple of times, and for some reason that felt appropriate to me, so I've decided to follow that lead. I'm very excited today. My good friend Christopher Mastropietro, who works very closely with John Vervaeke. He's been a co-author in several works with John. And they are quite good friends. Their recent work in After Socrates together for me, was an exemplification of how beautiful the synergy seems to be between them. And so I'm very grateful, Chris, that you're willing to join me again and chat a bit. And then we have David, or DC Schindler, depending on whether you're reading his books or talking to him. David has been so kind to have joined me, I think, 3 times in 1 week now with Jonathan Paggio, John Vervaeke, and now Christopher. So thank you so much for your time. David Schindler, DC Schindler, of course, is the author of several incredible books. One of my favorites is this book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, Love in the Postmodern Predicament, Freedom from Reality. I know there's a couple more, but those are the only ones that I've undertaken so far. But I'm so grateful that you're willing to come and join on an adventure into Mount Sophia. So
Thank you. Yeah, no, I've been enjoying these conversations very much.
Yeah. So if you both would like to say a little bit more about where you come from and kind of, I think we're going to explore into the notions of dialogos and some of the work that Christopher and John have done around putting together kind of a practice to move in that direction. And so if you both would like to say a little bit about what about dialogos, what comes to mind, what situates you in relation to that notion, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. I can say a little bit about that. So, yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation once again, Ken. This is wonderful. And David, what an exciting opportunity it is to talk to you. Boy, I have so many things to say about your work, but I'm just going to have to let that come up naturally. Otherwise, it's all going to bottle, and I'm going to get caught up in it. So, but really, it's a real pleasure. So yeah, I've been working with John. I was a student of John many years ago, and I've been working with him ever since. We have co-authored some publications together. The most notable is probably Zombies in Western Culture, a 21st Century Crisis, which is really about, it's an introduction to the meaning crisis through the mythogram of the zombie and the zombie motif. And I'm working with him right now on the book for Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, based on the lecture series. So we're hard at work on that too. And there are a whole bunch of projects in train related to that. So it's a busy time right now, but it's exciting. The dialogos in particular is really quite new within the last couple of years, and the last year intensively. And I think it's really hard to source its origins in some cases, because it just sort of gathered itself together to some degree of its own accord. And then John, being John, kind of reverse engineered a practice from it that was a little bit more technical and purposeful. But I would say there was some degree of spontaneity to it. And the spontaneity had a lot to do with this, had a lot to do with these spontaneous dialogues that seemed to actually get caught up in something more than just dialogue. They weren't debates, they weren't discussions. Something seemed to be happening. There was sort of a logos to them. There was sort of a sense of gathering together. And there was a sense that by the end of the conversation, everyone had this experience of being swept up on the winds of something that bore us all to a set of insights, but not a set of insights like just in the sort of propositional sense, but really just an orientation or an attitude or a feeling of participating in the unfolding of something that was very meaningful and that left ringing in its wake a real sense of pregnancy, almost a sense of midwifery in the Socratic sense of the term. And John and I had been having those kinds of discussions for years, and they're the kinds of discussions that I associated with sort of intimate friendships or intimate relationships, when they opened to something or triangulated to something, where you weren't just talking about yourself and you weren't just talking about ideas, you were somehow using both to participate in the disclosure of something that seemed to relate to you, but also relate you to what was beyond you. So, but all of that, I think it took a while to name that. It was just something that was happening. And then I think once this sort of medium started to pick up, and I was late to the game. John kind of dragged me in. I was actually very reluctant about it. I had a lot of reservations and concerns about it because of the risk, the potential for bullshit and the Frankfurtian sense. And it's also a very, there's a lot of exposure that comes with it. And there's a really informal, it's not like you're presenting a paper. You're just, there's an improvisational, spontaneous nature. And there's a lot that you risk when you do that, especially when you're participating with very formidable people, like right now. So, and also there's this sense, and you were talking about this, David, before we even started recording, but there's this sense of you're combining two things that actually haven't really been combined in this way before, which is the recorded. There's a sense in which this is recorded. There's a permanence to this, and there's also something dramatic and something spontaneous about it. And the something about that combination was both whatever was risky about it was correspondingly meaningful and had potential. And those two things seem to go together. So anyway, this is all to say that I think a lot of those early experiences, I think, inspired John, obviously in conjunction with a lot of reading and a lot of texts in the Socratic and Platonic tradition, to reverse engineer that, what happened spontaneously, into a dialectic, into a version of the dialectic that could try and put together the conditions to allow it to happen more reliably. And the last year has really been the dialectic into dialogos, practice or program has been an attempt, a very experimental attempt, to try and see what happens when we take these relational practices and combine them with sort of philosophical dialogue and do it in a more of a structured way. And so we're really in the throes of that now, and I don't know what it's bearing us to, but it's been exciting.
Well, no, thank you very much for that. I mean, that is very exciting, and I will be curious. Curious is not quite weighty enough word, but I'm very interested in seeing where that goes. My own work is very much connected to, as Ken said at the beginning. He mentioned the transcendentals, love and postmodern predicament, the transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty. I've for a long time had a strong sense that we need to understand those as dramatic realities, and one of the implications of that is that they are realities that occur socially through the joint participation of people. There's a very different it's a very different experience thinking a thought by oneself and thinking with another and having a thought sort of emerge through conversation. It sounds like that's what is baked into this notion of dialogos. Up to this point, I mean, I have outstanding colleagues at the John Paul II Institute where I teach, and my wife is also a philosopher, so I have a lot of opportunities in a way to live this experience. But it, in terms of formally thinking through this, is something I've sort of theorized, but I haven't had an opportunity to participate in an actual unfolding of the notion in the way that you just described. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity, and as I said, again, very interested to see where your project goes. This does seem to be something genuinely new and potentially very fruitful. Something that gives one hope, and hope is in short supply these days. So it's really something to learn about these sorts of projects. So thank you, and Ken, thanks for bringing us together here.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who is from the outside in a sense, right? I'm not an academic philosopher, and I have not gotten to even meet John in person yet. And so I kind of have come from the outside. I watched all of John's YouTube content, and then I participated in one of the Dialectic into Dialogos workshops, and that was I've had more than a few what I would call mystical experiences in my life, in various settings, but I don't know that I've experienced anything more profound and impactful than what I experienced in just a weekend of time, 6 hours one on Saturday, 6 hours on Sunday. And so for me, as someone who is on the outside experiencing as a way of coming into this, it was deeply powerful and did provide a lot of hope, kind of for the future of what we could become. And so I guess I'm seeing two possible directions of this conversation. I had a little bit of a thought of what I was going to do, and I'm happy to do that. But I am kind of hearing the possibility that maybe, Chris, you are tremendous at laying out kind of the structure of what the Dialectic into Dialogos practice looks like. And should you both be interested in it, I'm offering this as a proposal. Should you both be interested in it, we could possibly have Chris present that briefly, and then attempt to engage that practice for a round of that, or we can proceed in the direction of the discussion that I was going to propose, which was just to speak about truth and how to come together communally to see truth through language. So I'm seeing those two paths open to me, and I'm wanting to not necessarily direct it on my own.
Well, I'm happy to defer to your preference, David. What I might suggest is, the practice is something that takes, as you know, Ken, takes a little while to kind of get digested. What we could do is I'm happy to walk through it, but we could also just give David an opportunity to actually sort of see it in action, and then we could reconvene maybe with John and do a round with a little bit more sort of foresight. But having said that, I'm open. I'm happy to walk through it.
That sounds good. Yeah, it would be. It does sound like something that one would want to prepare oneself for. In a way, it's hard for me to make a judgment about, because I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that sounds great. I that was kind of the reservation that I had, and I didn't want to I want to do that because I know I have a taste of how powerful and how wonderful that experience would be, but my propensity is to rush into things, and so I don't want to.
No, but I mean, it is very intriguing. I mean, I had the impression that this was just a sort of a general idea, a kind of a certain value or something but I didn't realize it has this more sort of structured technical dimension, which is extremely intriguing. But it would be something I'd like to maybe prepare for. So.
Yeah, understandable. And I think there's a few, I mean, at this point, several sort of demonstrations that are out there. And I think we have now an instructional video out as part of John's After Socrates series that kind of binds it all together. So I can send that to you, David, and you can, and no pressure, this isn't something that's going to be for everyone. And it's still very, like I said, it's still very new. We're still trying to understand what it is. Like I always give that kind of qualification because I think it's really important. and also because it's still disclosing itself, and also I think it is an attempt to, you know, lay the conditions for something that does in fact happen spontaneously. Like I don't think that specific practice, I worry about it. I don't want to essentialize it. You know what I mean? It's a way in. It's just a way in.
That's right.
And I think the whole impetus for it was that we found ourselves in something, participating in something, and thought, wow, well, how, like, okay, let's take a few steps back. And how can we, this was John's work primarily, right? How can we take a few steps back and find a reliable way into this? Because also people are coming at it from such different places, right? John, of course, is coming in from that very, very sort of classically trained academic, multifarious in terms of other practices and whatnot. Right. But coming in from a very, very sort of formal and trained perspective. I'm not an academic. My sort of road in has a little bit more of an artistic spin. And then, we've got Guy Sengstock with us, and he's coming from circling, which is very much an interpersonal, relational practice. So it's one thing that's kind of interesting is that people have different roads into this. And I think one of its virtues seems to be that it seems to be able to make use of and enfold a lot of different idiosyncratic ways of relating to it, and somehow accommodates them. So, yeah.
All right. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts out of David's book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, and then a quote from that Chris stated in a conversation with Jonathan Pageau, and then I want to kind of just move from there and see where we go with this. So this is from page 256 in a chapter called "The Truth is Defenseless." It is not possible for the truth to take a purely private form. To the contrary, it must be structurally public. This implies that one obstructs one's own grasp of the truth, precisely to the extent that one excludes others from one's own pursuit of it. I was going to read more, but that's probably enough. And then a quote from, to relate to dialogos, something that Chris said in a conversation with Jonathan Pageau. What dialogos is, properly speaking, is a way of generating a symbolic process as a way of drawing forth logos and tracing it out and following it. So what does it mean for us to relate to each other in such a way that the truth becomes symbolized?
Yeah.
I might start by saying that as we've been talking about all of this, since reading, like Ken, I've read Plato's Critique of Impure Reason. I've acquired Love in the Postmodern Predicament. I haven't undertaken it yet, but it's right at the top of the queue. I'm a little late. I'm a little late, David, to the party. But I have to say, since then, I'm amazed. We were talking about just before starting to record about how, when you digest a certain line of thinking, it metabolizes and you find yourself speaking through it. It becomes the new way of speaking about things in general. And I have to say, and this is not, I mean this very, very sincerely, that your book had a way of doing exactly that, which is, especially the way that you articulate the relationship to the good and what it means almost in a dramaturgical sense. That I have to say was it provided a language for talking about this and talking about what we're doing that just grounded it so much, and gave it a texture and gave it a kind of a real specificity that I think was otherwise very hard to come by. So I really want to thank you for that. You've sort of already contributed to this process more than I think you could know. Because of the way that the lucidity that you bring to that topic, which is really, really difficult otherwise for us to get our heads around, I think allowed us to take it in hand a little bit more purposefully, or it certainly did that for me. and also gave a contrast. Like one word, John and I have both found ourselves saying dozens and dozens of times in these last several months is the word misology. That word was not part of my vocabulary before you introduced it. And I think that now, whenever I try to explain to myself or to anyone else what it is that we're trying to do, I usually explain it in contrast to that idea, which is that, you know, that it's the truth-seeking mode rather than it's the truth of the relational mode of engagement and the attitude rather than the truth of the claim that is uttered, that is actually the measure of what is unfolding. And that there's a certain self-sacrificial dimension to that process. And I think that your way of explaining that helped to give a lot of clarity to it and helped to strike a contrast with the classical form of debate where claims to truth are really just pretenses for a mode of engagement that is actually what is being spoken. And to make a careful distinction, right? What is actually being conveyed, right? It's probably not what's being said, what's being proposed, but it's whatever is driving or moving the proposal. You know, the idea that you say that, you know, claim is relative to the power sought, right? That the power sought is actually what is moving the orientation. And I think the whole premise, I think, of what we're trying to do, or what, not even what we're trying to do, but what seems to happen in genuine dialogos, is that the truth of the claim that is being made becomes completely incidental and serves the truth of the overall orientation that is a much more dramatic procedural attitude and openness toward the disclosure.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's wonderful to know that I made a contribution to what seems like such an interesting project in however modest a way there. But I would want to qualify one thing that you said, and you can let me know if you would accept this. Rather than saying that the claim is not the content of the claim as a proposition is not relevant, I would want to say that it's never exclusively relevant, but it's part of the picture, so that the mode of presenting a claim speaks eloquently, but not simply independently of what is said, so that the what and the how are constantly in the best case, well, actually, in fact, I think probably in every case, are interpreting each other in a way that's fruitful. It seems to me that's an important qualifier here. But and maybe you can comment on that. But just in terms of the original quotations that you read there, thank you, Ken. A dimension. It's interesting that the language of the symbol was not my language at all when I wrote that book, but I've come to it since then, and it's been snowballing, to use that expression. In fact, I mean, just this morning I've been writing about it all morning here. It's been overwhelming how important recovery of a profound sense of symbol seems to me, and precisely in relation to these things that you were talking about. But I think it's helps better illuminate what I was trying to say in many ways in the Plato book, and partly is that the point, the quotation. It's intriguing that you chose that particular line, but the public nature of it, the manifest nature of truth that brings it beyond the merely propositional, like you were saying, Christopher, that it's becoming increasingly apparent to me how important the setting It's really interesting. The setting in which conversation takes place is, and that depends in great part on the disposition of the people speaking and their openness to each other and so forth. But also in very subtle ways and interesting ways, it depends on the physical nature of the space, the beauty in it, the comfort, the body language, that there really is a manifest quality that I think is part of the meaning of truth that needs to be recovered in order to have a proper understanding of what mythology is as the rejection of truth. It's part of this great dramatic whole. But anyway, I could go on and on about that, but I'll stop there, just to invite comment, or if you want to move it in a different direction or whatever.
Oh, thank you for that, David. So the first of all, I appreciate the qualification about the sort of I think you call it a form content unity in the book, right? Between the sort of the content of the claim and the orientation of the claim.
Yeah.
So that there's and that's a really good qualification. I appreciate that. It's not that they're at variance or at quits.
Right. Yeah.
Or that it's one at the expense of the other, but that whatever the tension is between them is there's a reciprocal informing of one another, right?
Yeah. Saying and showing at the same time.
Saying and showing at the same time, right. So I'd just be interested. I mean, I'm thinking about that in the context of Plato's dialogues, and I'm thinking of that, let's say, in the context of the many points in those dialogues where Socrates would be making an argument, and the argument itself might be actually not, it might not be a properly logical argument, or the argument, if you look at it just on its face, might be a spurious argument. But there's a deeper move that he's making with that argument, right? That argument is actually being used to adduce something and to draw something out. And so if you extract the argument and just took it at its letter, you would find it wanting. But because the argument is embedded in sort of this pragmatic context, that it's being used in such a way, it's taking on the full scope of what it's being used for. I'm just wondering if you can speak to, like, if you can sort of riff on that a little bit more, because I'd love to hear you talk about that and how it works in the dialogues.
Well, there's so much there, but just to take a trivial example, but it's striking to me, for instance, how Plato has been criticized in his interpretation of love for losing the individual. That the individual persons are just sort of springboards to goodness itself, which is a universal concept that one then enjoys in this sort of immediate way on the steps of the ladder of human beings or something. I mean, it's a ridiculous criticism from one perspective, but there are certain grounds for it when you see his ladder of love, for instance, in the Symposium, and his apparent rejection of the body, say, in the Phaedo. But it's very different if you put things in context. In the Phaedo, you have these moments, for instance, where Socrates strokes the hair of Phaedo. You're going to have to cut these locks. I mean, the affection and the interest in the person and the particularity of the person is extraordinary. I mean, there's a gesture there that actually seems to me opens the meaning of the sense of these things. The transcendence of the body is not, and then of the individual in a way, is not a leaving of the individual behind. It's a distinctive perspective on the individual that you are with, seeing the individual precisely as a manifestation of goodness rather than simply as a function of my immediate desires or something like that. But it still is manifest in the individual. Anyway, that would be just a small instance where you have the dramatic action interpreting the claims that are being made, or setting up a context in which they're meant to be interpreted. The tradition that developed, especially in Anglo-American philosophy, of formalizing the arguments in abstraction from the context. I mean, that does such a brutal violence to so much that's in Plato, and I think people are realizing that this recovery of the dramatic element is becoming increasingly common in readings of Plato. Thank goodness. But I think I think we need to go a step further in all of that, and the step further is not just that we see that these are interesting rhetorical devices that Plato is using to try to communicate a point, but it's actually, insofar as the writing of the dialogue is a manifestation of reason, it's a kind of exemplum of what it means to reason. That this very concrete and dramatic form is essential to the very nature of reason. I think that's a dimension that we can appreciate more than we typically do.
Right. So this makes me think of your what you brought up, sort of Plato's critique of writing in the Phaedrus beforehand, and this makes me think of that critique and the kind of the interesting paradox that is on display here. The fact that that writing is under critique, but of course the form of that insight and the form of the whole process in which that insight is produced is actually captured in that medium. And yet it seems to me that because of the inherently dramatic relational nature of the dialogue, its presentation in writing is almost subverted by what the writing is actually inducing, right? So that it's sort of, very much like a play, right? That the play is actually meant to be performed.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be excerpted or extracted from. It is a whole, and it has to be experienced dramatically. It has to effectively be lifted from the page in order to be actually made real. And so there's something I'm hearing in what you're saying. There's something about what the dialogues are actually doing is they're trying to work themselves away from their own medium. Yeah. And there's just this interesting tension and paradox in the very creation of something whose goal is beyond its own constraints.
Yeah, that tension is. We talked a little bit about Kierkegaard in the beginning too, before going online here, and I mean, he had such an extraordinary sensitivity to precisely that point. But I'm going to qualify it yet again here. That it seems to me, and this is something. I'm going to be there's a really profound book that has recently been published by Thomas Fowle, Incomprehensible Certainty, this massive tome on the nature of images and kind of a philosophical, historical, theological, artistic, poetic reflection on the nature of images in human existence. And I'm going to be commenting on him at a seminar in a couple of days here. So I've been thinking about this. He addresses some of these points that there's an image is properly appreciated when we don't look at it. Jean-Luc Marion, if you're familiar with him, the idol and the icon. We don't so much look at it; we look through it. Now, it seems to me. There's more that's an absolutely central and important point, but it seems to me one of the most surprising dimensions of the Republic, say, Plato's philosophy, but this is most evident in the Republic, is that we not only pass through the image to a deeper meaning, but then we return to the image. That coming back down. To transcend and then return to, that to me, it brings a kind of final closure. It introduces all sorts of possibilities, a riskiness and possibilities of ambiguity. But it seems to me that there's something really crucial about that. unless we take full cognizance of it, there will always be a temptation to think of the embodiment and the concrete and perception and so forth as simply a vehicle to something more. And I don't want to deny that it's that. So I think it's crucial that we do transcend images, and we transcend the body, and we transcend writing. But we also return to it now as those who know that in a way intensifies the paradox and the tension. It just makes it explode. I mean, that's why. I mean, it's precisely Plato's critique of writing that makes his writing so incredibly powerful. Again, you could say the same thing about Kierkegaard, I think, in all sorts of ways.
Totally. That's beautiful. Well, I was just going to say, like, that bidirectional movement, and I know you talk about it. You use the descent back into the cave in the book as an illustration of that, the simultaneous movement, the ascent and the descent. That's exactly how Kierkegaard talks about faith, is that bidirectional move and the paradox of that move. And that idea that you have to, that right of return, the fact that right of return is built in, which also makes it a recursive process,
right,
and a compounding process.
Exactly.
Right.
Compounding, and that's why it's like infinite. It just fills the finite with infinite depth, without it ceasing to be finite. And there really is something just very thrilling about that
this
point.
This makes me think a little bit about the initial clarification that you added to that idea that the statements or the propositions become less important in the sense that they don't have to be rock solid because we're looking through them, is kind of the sense that I had. But but you added the clarification, but they are important too. And there's a way in which, I guess, this journeying towards truth by means of words and then coming back through them, right? Like this move in and out.
Yeah.
Like this is something that I struggle with a lot. And I was struggling with it a lot even at the beginning of this conversation, is that there's something that I want to birth into the meeting of the three of us, that because I'm so excited and trying so hard to do it, I'm struggling and falling all over myself, because in a sense I was trying too hard with the words to get them right. But conversely, then I'm doing that thing where I'm getting stuck in them. And so there's this weird dance of like, I want to get the words correct so that I can really see through them, so that they can become true symbols of what I'm trying to see. But if I try too hard to get the words correct, I can't move through them to see beyond them.
Yeah, no, that's the word that Plato uses, it seems to me, for the proper relationship is a playful seriousness. I mean, it's or a serious playfulness, and it's absolutely crucial that there's that paradox again, because it's not that the words become insignificant, but I mean, in a certain sense they do, but then that gives them all the more significance. And the thing about, I was thinking about, the word symbol, the original use of the word symbol is the symbolon, the tesserae hospitalis. You would break in an act of friendship, you would take a piece of pottery and break it apart. And the two friends would take the pieces and perhaps even pass them down in their family. But when the families, the friends or the families meet again together, they in a ritual of friendship, they rejoin these together. And you can say there's a certain sense in which the very physical stuff of this symbol has carried the friendship. That it abides in these things in some real way. Now, in another sense, of course, it doesn't. It's not like you break this and there's no possibility for friendship anymore. But in another way, there's something, and the friends recognize the importance of it. And when they meet again, they take a supreme delight in joining the shards together again, not because their friendship depends on it in a way, but it does also, but it becomes a kind of a seal. It becomes a physical manifestation, a kind of a symbol, and a dramatic manifestation of the truth of their friendship, which they celebrate together. That's why I liked you said the rite of return, Christopher. There's there's a ritual aspect of that that's really crucial and beautiful, that I think is essential to the meaning of all of this.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. What a beautiful way of that example is really actually very moving. That example of the part that these pieces that have to be rejoined. Right? It makes me think of the way you talk about the bonocentric movement as being the relationship of the part to the whole.
Yeah, I forgot. Yeah.
Right. But it's just beautifully apt. And this idea that there's and that qualification that you made about the content of the claim, the relationship between the content of the claim to its form, that I that's well taken too, because it's something like that serious playfulness that John, it's funny, I don't know if that's just a coincidental convergence of thinking, but talks about it
he talks about that too.
Exact same words, in fact, the exact same words,
same inflection and everything. It's perfect.
And I think that's what I was trying to get at with the irony too, which is not a hardened subversion as much as a recognition that the claim, that there is an inherent brokenness to the claim because it falls so short of its mark.
Right.
And that the falling so short of its mark becomes a way of orientation itself. Yeah. There's something it's gilded or redeemed by its orientation, and it's that's what connects the Christian and the Platonic so beautifully too, right? Is that exact formulation, something like that.
That's right. The gilded. That's nice. And I mean, and think about the importance of words, not just as a vehicle of communication, but having a symbolic. So the creed. I mean, you mentioned the Christian. The creed was originally called the symbol of the faith, and not a symbol, not in the sense of a sign that points to something, but symbol in the sense of, in our saying this together, we unite in a way that would be like the friends joining the shards. And so in these words, we're connecting. The people are being connected in the saying of these words. It'd be something like a group of people singing together. That's something I've had many. In fact, it's something we've been cultivating in some way at the institute where I teach. When we have events that the whole community of students and professors are together, we often try to incorporate music, bring instruments, and there's something about all together, everyone singing these words of these songs, that establishes a connection that's very difficult to establish otherwise, that achieves something that something comes into being that you couldn't really produce otherwise. And the nature of the songs do matter. It's the songs that are celebrating friendship or celebrating somehow something beautiful, something that we all believe in, something that we love. Friendship itself, that's part of it. And there you end up getting this infinite, the mirrors reflecting each other, this kind of recursive compounding explosion into infinity of and that to me, that's part of what it means, what the word symbol means, is precisely this event of this creative event of coming together.
That explains so well why music and musicality is so hallowed in the Christian tradition. Like I think of someone like Augustine, who didn't have time for many forms of art, but always held a candle for music and hymns, and at least as I recall, and that there's something so exemplary about that relationship between form and content is somehow somehow it's somehow realized in ways within music that is I mean, maybe that's why there's something so reverential about music, even in its most secular and unreligious forms, that invites a kind of participation that we all seem to just gather around pre-reflectively. And maybe it has, maybe one of the reasons for that is that it exemplifies that unity between form and content in that participatory mode in ways that speech and discussion and in ways that discursive forms and other forms of sociability just for whatever reason don't do.
Yeah, and think about then reinterpreting conversation precisely as a kind of an analogous expression of singing together, that then I intuit, and I could be way off, but it what you were talking about is the dialogos it seems to me would be something like this, possibly, that there's a kind of joining together in speech and conversation that has something of this joint elevation of all involved at the heart of it. You mentioned, Ken, something of a mystical experience. I mean, mystical, some people think of that as eerie, spooky, sort of magic, but mystical has a very normal human meaning as well, that I think is necessary to see in order to grasp the significance of these really unique experiences that we all will have at one moment or another. But every conversation is a mystical experience in a certain way, if it's a good one, and that there's a certain sort of a beauty in the words that join us together in a real insight.
Yeah. Well, there's something about a harmony, right? That the harmonization of the various, like in those moments where I really experienced the depth of dialogos, and it's not, I mean, that weekend was phenomenal, but I've had it in conversations such as this one where it feels as if the various parts of myself that are usually in some kind of tension relationship to each other coalesce into something like a harmony. And the because each one has an insight in it, right? And there's this element of trust that I felt like, Chris, you said something, I was back a little ways and you were talking about the way in which the brokenness of it allows for the transcendent to come through kind of sense. And that, like, I felt in my body the sense of like landing into a sense of trust is the best I can explain it. And that somehow that provides this through line of being the self, if I can use it that way, and that then opens up the possibility of the conversation becoming something like a musical kind of mystical experience type idea.
Yeah, I mean, I harmony, and I quite literally, I don't know if this has been your experience. This has been very much my experience. It's been repeated many times. In fact, my original experience of this, I won't go into all the details, but was invited to join this choir when I was just learning how to sing back when I was a sophomore in college, because I was studying in France. It was this massive choir, and the teacher had us break into groups and taught us the song. And once we learned the song, then suddenly I had no idea what a round was, but he had us sing it in a round, and the parts harmonized. And I almost jumped out of my skin. I had no idea this was coming, and it was extraordinary. It was it made such a powerful impression on me. And this has been repeated. I mean, just actually recently we had some people over and we were singing, and we managed to do some harmonies. there's a depth that occurs in the harmonizing that you can't get with a single voice. Now, why is that? Why is that so beautiful and moving? It has something to do with this, whole that parts join together and create a whole that's greater than this, and then actually participate in them. So that becomes a kind of a transformation of the parts. And there are many different dimensions, but that's certainly part of it, I think.
I think it absolutely is, because it's almost like each role, each part gets to be more of itself.
Yeah.
When it participates in that harmony, right? It's not just that, well, I have my role and I stick to it, and I appreciate that I have a role in the broader composition, but
Right.
it's that my part, there's a graduation even within my part, that there's more even to my part, right? This idea that you become more, I think you said something like this, that you become more of yourself when you're participating in something harmonious, that you discover like yourself is disclosed to you. And I think there's sort of in this kind of process, in this kind of ritual process, there's both, that's what throws it into both directions, that there's this sense that you're participating in the more of that whole as it comes together in harmony, but there's a reflexive component where there's more of you that corresponds to the disclosure of the whole. And they disclose in tandem with one another. There's synchronization.
That's right. And that more, the moreness is manifest in your own little part. It's actually inside of it in a way that these kinds of things also have political implications and economic implications. I mean, it seems to me that we tend to think of things like the common good and those sorts of things very superficially, as just a collection of individual goods, and sort of one expression of that is to think of, the Adam Smith sort of form, that if each of us just pursues what our own self-interest, that's going to, at some level, generate a larger good. And so we don't really have to, we can sort of let that take care of itself and just focus. And there are all sorts of things one might say about, and criticisms that one might raise, but one of them misses precisely what we're talking about in this harmonization. Your participation in the common good is something much more like singing in harmony in a choir, and it transforms. One of the things that becomes so exciting about your own role is experiencing its significance in relation to the others, and to have the others present in oneself, in one's singing, and I think our activity in the social order can be understood as analogous to that. That our individual pursuits become much more interesting and much more our own when we not only conceptually recognize, but actually experience them as participatory in some larger whole. I think that's, Anyway, that moves the conversation in a bit of a different direction, but I think that's an important aspect.
Well, there's this component of listening that the reflexive aspect and all of these things. The symbol has, in order for it to happen at a higher level, it has to happen inside me. For me to harmonize, I can't do it unless I hear first, or together with. It's the sequence is a problem, but there's a together with hearing that happens, and that individuation, especially, maybe it's so obvious and so pernicious, maybe at the level of the social and political and economic, where we have such a hard time hearing. And if I want to sing in the choir, or if I want to participate in the harmonization of a conversation that's drawing me into a transcendent whole that is beyond myself, and I become more than I am, there's a surrender that takes place in the listening, to something beyond myself.
That's beautiful. Well, because then you can listen to yourself through the ears of the choir as a whole. Right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean listening to the
Yeah.
sum of opinions that the choir has about your singing. That's a different thing, right? You get to listen to yourself through the harmony, and that's how you tell if you're out of tune.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this comes back to your idea of mythology, David, because I think that if I've understood you right, then that is something like mistaking your part for the whole and asserting it as the whole. And you lose the capacity to listen to yourself and to tell, right? You lose the humility and the humiliation in the more positive, edifying sense of the term. You lose the capacity for that when you simply extend yourself, right? When you try and be a soloist when you're within a choir, right?
Yeah. That's in fact, it's interesting. In on our faculty, we have Margie McCarthy. She's our choir director, and she's directing these very sort of amateur choirs, but elevates them way beyond what they ought to be capable of, given the background and experience and so forth. But part it's because of a sensitivity. One of the things she's often said in choir practice is, when you sing, make sure you can hear the people next to you. Don't just try to block them out and sing your part and hope that it's going to harmonize, but listen to the people next to you. And that just, in a very spontaneous, natural way, brings your voices into a deeper sort of connection than they would be otherwise. But that point that you made, Christopher, about in a way hearing yourself from the perspective of the other, that's a really crucial dimension to this. It calls to mind an observation made by Robert Spemann. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a philosopher that died a couple of years ago. Really, he was one of the greats that was still alive. I used to point to him as one of the great living philosophers still with us, but now, just like Ferdinand Ulrich, too, two of the greats are no longer with us. But anyway, he once observed, in a sort of criticism of Hegel, who wants to build in otherness into our understanding of ourselves, but fails in all sorts of ways. He took a very simple example. He recalled a bumper sticker that he saw once. He's German. I don't know how it would have read in German, but the translation was think of your wife and drive safely. And what he interpreted that to mean is that it's a very simple statement, but he said, think about the radical transcendence. You're not just thinking about your own safety. You're looking at yourself from the perspective of someone other than yourself, and considering your significance to that person, and giving that a kind of priority. I mean, that there's a radical kind of a transformation there, and I think that's of the essence of this capacity to participate in a whole that we've been talking about.
There's something about the difference between description and explanation as a posture here, right? Because I feel as if I'm often looking at myself through what I perceive to be others' lenses, right? But it's generally what my general reaction usually is that of explanation. I'm imagining that, say, my wife sees something in me which is a fault that I'm perceiving in myself, and my response is to come up with an explanation as to why it's happening, which is very different from a response which is just a descriptor, right? And it feels, I don't know if I can land this all the way back around to what I'm feeling with it, but that move towards just describing what's going on instead of explaining what's going on allows me in some way to lessen the tension such that I can listen. It's like, if I'm explaining, I can't listen to what's real about this viewing through another because I'm blocking it or something.
Yeah, I mean, maybe another way of putting describing is letting it be in a kind of a profound sense of giving priority to the reality in the first place, rather than immediately trying to translate it into some other terms. That might be part of it.
Which
Yeah,
goes back to the surrender. Sorry, Chris.
yeah, no, please, Ken.
Well, just that's something that for me has been so important, is to try to remember, in the deep sense of the word, the notion of surrender.
And there's a great, it's funny you say that, Ken, because I've been thinking a lot about that, specifically in respect of this, like this endeavor, this kind of activity, and thinking a lot about how much we all, like, I've had this experience of myself where I've learned a lot about the way I just, what is naturally called out of me when pressurized in the container of a dialogue such as this, because you have unreflective reactions and responses to things, and there's often no time to forestall or prevent them or block them, and that's a virtue, I think, of the activity, and that something spontaneous is called forth. But there's a certain surrendering to that, because, it's hard to be prepared for the revelation that comes from that, because just like when you're participating in the choir, you learn about your own voice. When you see its dissonance or its assonance, or whatever the case is, with the other voices around you, and something is called into distinction. You are called into distinction. There's a resolution brought to yourself before your own eyes and ears that is striking, always surprising, because it's because you don't get to, it's not an idea of yourself that you've been able to hatch within the confines of your own imagination. It's something that is being presented to you by the container of the activity. And there's a certain amount of recoil, I think, that has, right? So, and that can be I think that's sort of that's the challenging side of the practice, or that's a challenging side of this kind of confrontation, is that you're forced to reckon with yourself and your own tonality in ways that you might not otherwise have to do in a more monologic context. And there's a demand that puts on all of us. And it's an existential demand, which is, to me, really one of the more interesting parts of this whole story, is the existential demand that is foisted on us when we are confronted by our role in the harmony and find ourselves atonal and are wondering how to, like, what that means, because our whole sense of self is thrown into question, right?
That's right. That line of thinking always brings to mind one of my all-time favorite quotations from Iris Murdoch. Love is the difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. I mean, that there's something so profound about that. But why is that difficult? Because, I mean, a lot. It's just as you described. You are called to conform to rise up to something, to do justice to something that exceeds the boundaries that you have allowed to be set, that you've somehow set for yourself. But as I was thinking, as you were talking, a further thought occurred to me, and I wonder. I haven't thought this before, but let me know what you think about this. That it seems to me that so you have the moment of recoil, as you put it, this sort of painful realization of how you fall short and how you are out of step or out of harmony. It seems to me there's a dramatic moment there, and to the extent that we end. This is going to be a dramatic, sort of maybe an overly dramatic word, but I think it's technically right. To the extent that we allow that kind of despair of that to be the where we land, to use the language you've been using, Ken. It seems to me we've ended up falling back into ourselves, and that to the extent that we actually remain faithful to this reality that transcends us, that the painfulness of falling short is always going to be recontextualized by a kind of joy and a sense of resolution and happiness of reality as good, true, and beautiful, having the word that trumps the word of my despair. Yeah, what do you think of that?
So I think that you are technically right. I think that despair is le mot juste. And it actually sounds something, just maybe bring in the Kierkegaardian language, it sounds something like the despair of necessity.
Yeah.
Right. And in some sense then the need to surrender yourself, not to the measure of, again, it's not to the measure of the crowd, but it's to the measure of the unfolding that happens when the crowd is harmonious.
Yeah.
Something like that, right? And that being open to, there's this sense of giving up oneself to being known by a greater measure beyond your knowing of yourself, that seems to be the way out of that kind of despair. And I think I'm hearing that in what you're saying too, David.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that deeply. I mean, that's often my experience in conversations such as this, is that I find myself moving in and out of the harmony of it. And it seems sometimes that I love the use of the word despair, because it can be despairing, but there's a way in which it's almost like if I hold on to that despair, it's the rejection of the thing itself to hold on to it, as opposed to allow it to be taken. Right. It has to be let go of.
That's right.
And that's when the moment of self-transcendence seems to occur.
Yeah, right. And what's interesting about it is it's a self-transcendence that includes a very objective sense of your own failure, but doesn't let that have the last word. I mean, because I've wondered sometimes in exercises of self-examination, one can think of one's faults and fall into a sense of paralysis. This is hopeless. Again, despair. Or there have been other times where going over the same sort of faults, there's a kind of an inspiration and almost an excitement of that. So what's the difference? I think and the difference is just as you're putting it, Ken, that in one case you actually are the ultimate measure is yourself, and therefore how you've fallen short. In the other case, it's the goodness of reality that transcends yourself, that includes this judgment of your failures, but contextualize, reorients them to something positive. And I mean, that's simple language, but I think there's something really, really profound there. That this isn't so far from some of Saint Ignatius's principles of discernment of spirits, actually. But that's a whole other. That just occurred to me. That's a whole other line.
Yeah. That is profound. Because you're tempted to seize on the despair. I think this is what I'm hearing and what you're getting at, Ken, is that you to some sense you have to sit within it. You have to you have to have a proper confrontation with it, and you have to commune with it very intimately in order to know its contents, right? And to know you have to pass through it in some sense. But in passing through it, there is this
justice to it. Yeah.
And do justice to it, right? But in passing through it, there is this great and almost diabolical, to use your word, David, an almost diabolical temptation to seize upon it and to make whatever is spoken by the despair into the measure of what's real, right? And then you get into like your failure is the only thing that's real. It's the only thing that starts to matter. And when you get into that state, it is the only thing that can pull you out of that state is some perspective that can love you in such a way that you are not reducible to that failure.
There's it's almost like a surrender to the experience of despair with a recognition that somehow I'm still there. Like in
Mhm.
spite of the way in which I can't acknowledge that anything else feels to be real. Somehow, as you said, David, the goodness of reality holds me despite that.
Yeah. 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 I mean, this is where I find that the language of being really crucial. Yeah, the sense of, because one is tempted to speak of God here too, and that's there's a absolutely a point to that, but I, it seems important to me that we not overstep also the fact that reality is good,
Mhm.
and that the love that sort of calls us beyond this measure is sort of built into things in some way. It's not outside of the world, simply because otherwise that can reinforce despair in other sorts of curious ways.
Yeah.
I'm curious actually, David, now that, because I think that's a profound point. And I think that's maybe a point that's like this point of tension that I know I feel between sort of the Platonic and the way that the Platonic and the Christian orientations kind of collide and
Yeah.
find themselves they're so convergent in so many deep ways. But then there's this point where there's this tension, and it has something to do, I think, with the fact that in one case, the kind of solicitude that you're receiving and participating in takes on this sort of generalized character of being itself, of the
Yeah.
good. And in another case, you have
Mhm.
it really, like, you have it concentrated into a
Yeah.
personification.
Right.
And I often don't know what to make of that. And I think in some cases, being able to confront both aspects of that dichotomy between, the finite suffocating nature of man and the open-ended infinite
Mhm.
side, and to have those actually embodied and personified makes the receipt of that solicitude more available, at least
Mhm.
to a lot of people, rather than to understand it as being a sort of a feature of being in the abstract. And I find myself ambivalent about that
Yeah.
difference, and
Yeah.
ambivalent about that relationship. And
Yeah.
I said, I'm just really curious to know, like,
Yeah.
what your reaction to that
Yeah.
tension is.
I mean, Ken and I have talked about this before. It's interesting. My path was sort of in the other direction. I found the notion of the good a much more compelling initially than explicitly religious language. But at a certain point, I realized they're inseparable, and I think that would be. I think ambivalence is right. There's something there's an irreducible difference between these, but that they're also, I think, both essential, indispensable, and not to equalize them either. I mean, I think that there are asymmetries and so forth, but I think it's crucial both to affirm goodness, truth, and beauty, being, and so forth, and the personal God and the historical self-revelation of God in Christ. That those are both very, very different registers, but um, inseparable ultimately.
I like that, different registers.
Mm.
That lands beautifully. That just, yeah, that's really helpful, actually, that turn of phrase.
Yeah, I feel woefully under equipped to say anything about this, but I guess in my sense, it feels like there was so much a sense of closure and tyranny in the understanding of God that I grew up with.
Mm.
And the Platonic route of opening has been very healing in that
Yeah.
state, in that relation.
Yeah.
And but there's a way in which it also won't let me go.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I find myself, I said in my doing a commentary on John's After Socrates, and I played off the Kierkegaardian words and said I follow Jesus, but John Vervaeke is my teacher. And that's been really, really true for me, like very, very deeply true for me. And so I feel that tension, and I'm often poking at that tension, but I'm doing it. I find that the wrestling with it and opens both for me, and both seem to ever recede before me and also welcome me in. That's about all I have, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you use the language of both and there. That's what. Yeah, I think that's really, at least in my experience, that's been crucial. Yeah. Anyway, there'd be I actually I'm gonna have to run in just a moment.
Yes.
Family matters, but there would be a whole lot to say about all this. As usual, these conversations open up as much as they close or bring to resolution, and that's, I think, the sign of a very good conversation. So
yes, hopefully we can continue, and as we foreshadowed earlier, if you are so disposed, David, at some point doing a formal dialectic into dialogos, possibly with John, would be quite lovely. But thank you both so much.
What we need to do, we need to get a seminar and like an actual meeting at some point, and spend a weekend, a common text or something like that. Yeah,
that would be lovely.
That's a great idea. I think we can start sort of turning our minds to that in the coming weeks and months. I think it's a great idea.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any final words or thoughts for either of you before we close?
Just a big thank you to both of you. Ken, first of all, just for you have this great talent for bringing people together and just stimulating things in just the right way with just the right kinds of questions and observations. So I just really appreciate you for that. And David, what a pleasure! Just what a pleasure. Like I said, your thoughts and work has been so influential already, and by no means is that's just beginning. So it was such a privilege to get to speak with you.
No, thank you. I feel the same, and ditto about the thanks to Ken. And this has the feeling of being a beginning. So I hope to see you all again soon.
All right. All the best.